In the spring of 1935, a soil scientist named Hugh Bennett walked into a Senate hearing room in Washington and began, very deliberately, to waste everyone's time. He had charts nobody wanted to look at and a plan that hinged entirely on the weather 2,000 miles away. Bennett knew a dust storm had torn loose from the southern plains days earlier and was grinding its way east across the country, and he had timed his testimony to stall, to ramble, to stretch the hearing out long enough for that storm to reach the Capitol. To the senators in the room, he looked like a crank running out the clock. He was actually gambling the entire future of American farmland on a cloud of dirt arriving on schedule. And then the windows went dark. The sky over the Capitol turned a sick yellow-brown. The afternoon sun shrank to a dull copper coin, and fine grit from 1,000 miles away began sifting down onto the marble steps of Washington. Bennett pointed at the window. "This," he said, "is what I have been trying to tell you about." Weeks later, Congress gave him what he wanted, but to understand why a government scientist was betting the nation's soil on the wind, you have to understand what was happening out west, in the place the newspapers had just started calling the Dust Bowl. And you have to understand that this catastrophe, the worst ecological disaster in American history, was not a drought. The drought was only the trigger. The bomb had been built on purpose by hand over 30 years by people who were sure they were doing everything right. For 10,000 years, the southern Great Plains had been covered by a sea of short grass. Buffalo grass, blue grama, tough, low, unremarkable to look at. But the magic of that grass was underground. Its roots drove 5, 6, 7 feet into the earth and wove together into a dense living mat, a net that held the soil in place and locked moisture beneath the surface through years of drought and decades of wind. The plains are dry and the plains are windy, and they had always been dry and windy, and none of it mattered because the grass held everything down. That root mat was the lid on the system. As long as it stayed shut, the soil could not blow away, no matter how hard the wind howled. Then people took the lid off. Starting in the late 1800s and exploding during the First World War, settlers poured onto the plains chasing a dream the government and the railroads were busy selling. The slogan was "Rain follows the plow," the pseudo-scientific fantasy that breaking the soil would somehow pull moisture out of the sky and change the climate itself. It was nonsense. But wheat prices were sky high. The war in Europe had created enormous demand, and the new gasoline tractor could rip up more prairie in a day than a team of horses could manage in a week. So they plowed. They plowed the grass under by the millions of acres. Suitcase farmers showed up, tore open the sod, planted wheat, took one good harvest, and walked away from the bare dirt behind them. In a few short years, more than 5 million acres of ancient grassland were turned upside down. The root mat shredded, the soil the grass had guarded for 10,000 years left naked and exposed to the sky. For a while, the rains came and the wheat grew, and everyone congratulated themselves. Then, in 1931, the rain stopped, and the system that had been quietly disarmed revealed exactly what had been done to it. Here is the machine that nearly destroyed the plains, and it is brutally simple. Bare soil dries out, dry soil is light, wind lifts light soil into the air, and the southern plains have wind the way the ocean has waves, constant, relentless, hammering across 1,000 flat miles with nothing to slow it down. The grass used to be the thing that slowed it down. Now there was nothing. So the wind picked up the dead, dry, plowed topsoil and carried it away. And here is where it became a death spiral, a loop that fed on itself and accelerated every year. When the topsoil blew away, it took with it the organic matter, the dark living crumb that holds water like a sponge. What was left behind was lighter, drier, deader, and even easier for the wind to lift. Less soil meant less moisture, which meant less chance for anything to grow, which meant more bare ground, which meant more soil in the air, which meant the next storm carried off even more. Every year, the ground got poorer and the wind got richer. The storms became something out of the end of the world. They called them black blizzards, walls of dirt thousands of feet tall that rolled across the horizon and turned noon into midnight. On April 14th, 1935, the day that became known as Black Sunday, one of these walls swallowed the region. People caught outside could not see their own hands. Static electricity from the flying dust shorted out car engines and knocked men off their feet when they reached out to shake hands. Children got lost walking home from school. They called the illness dust pneumonia, the lungs of the very young and the very old filling with the same dirt that had once grown their food. The soil did not just leave, it left sickness and despair behind it. At the worst of it, around 100 million acres had been stripped or badly damaged. And the dust did not stay local. It blackened the snow in New England. It dusted the desks of Congress as the senators in Bennett's hearing learned firsthand. It fell on the decks of ships 300 miles out in the Atlantic Ocean. And the people simply left. Roughly 2.5 million of them abandoned the plains during the 1930s, the largest migration in American history. Families with everything they owned roped to the roof of a Model T, driving west toward California, and the hope of any work at all. The land was emptying out. The economy was gone. The towns were dying. And here is where almost everyone got the solution exactly wrong, because the obvious answer was also the worst one. The instinct of a farmer watching his crop fail is to fight harder with the tools he already has. Plow more, plant more, wait for rain, and double down. And that is precisely what kept happening. More breaking of the soil, more bare ground turned to the wind, in the belief that the enemy was the drought. But you cannot outfarm a drought, and every additional acre plowed in that fight just loaded the next storm. The early response from Washington missed the point too. The government sent emergency cash, bought up starving cattle and shot them by the hundreds of thousands, handed out relief to keep families from going under. All of it humane, all of it necessary, and none of it touching the actual problem, because the actual problem was not the farmers' empty bank accounts, and it was not even the sky. The actual problem was lying in the open with nothing holding it down. The men who threw money at the crisis and prayed for rain were treating the symptoms of a system whose anchor had been ripped out. And that is the insight Hugh Bennett had been shouting into the wind for years while nobody listened. Bennett was a soil scientist from North Carolina who had spent his career watching American farmland erode. And he understood one thing the politicians and most of the farmers did not. The enemy was never the drought. Droughts come and droughts go, and the plains had survived 1,000 of them. The enemy was bare ground. You cannot make it rain. But you can stop the soil from leaving, and if you keep the soil where it is, it will be ready and waiting when the rain finally comes back. Reframe the catastrophe around that single idea, and the fix stops being mysterious. The grass had been the LAD. So put a lid back on. If you came for stories of dead places brought back to life, subscribe, because this is where it gets good. Bennett's answer came in 2 parts, and neither of them was high technology. The first part was to cover the soil and put roots back into it, using a handful of embarrassingly simple farming techniques. Stop plowing straight up and down the slopes, which carves channels that let water and dirt race downhill, and plow across them instead, along the contour of the land, so that every furrow becomes a tiny dam that catches the rain instead of shedding it. Rotate crops and plant cover crops so the ground is never left naked between harvests. Leave the dead stubble of last year's crop standing in the field instead of burning or clearing it, so the stalks act like armor, breaking the wind at ground level and pinning the soil down. Plant in strips, alternating bands of crop and grass, so that even if one strip starts to blow, the strip beside it catches the moving dirt. None of this required a machine that did not already exist. It was just a different way of holding the ground. And the second part of Bennett's answer was even more audacious, and it is the one that got him laughed at. To break the wind itself, the government would plant a forest, not a normal forest, but a 100-mile-wide ribbon of trees running 2,000 miles down the spine of the country, from the Texas Panhandle north through Oklahoma, Kansas, Nebraska, the Dakotas, all the way to the Canadian border. The Prairie States Forestry Project, most people called it the Great Plains Shelterbelt, and on paper it sounded insane. You are going to plant trees, hundreds of millions of trees, in the middle of the worst drought in living memory, in a place so dry it was actively killing the crops that were supposed to grow there. The head of the Forest Service himself initially thought it was a boondoggle. And yet the physics behind it was rock solid, because a shelter belt does not need to be a lush forest. It only needs to be a speed bump for the wind. Here is the thing about wind erosion that makes the entire solution work. The wind does its damage in the few feet closest to the ground, and its power to lift soil climbs steeply with its speed. Slow that ground-level wind down even a little, and its ability to pick up dirt collapses. A single row of trees standing across the path of the wind forces the air up and over, and on the far side, for a distance of 10 or 20 times the height of the trees, the wind near the ground is broken and weak. Think of cupping your hand around a candle flame in a breeze. You are not stopping the wind, you are just creating a small pocket of calm in its shadow, and in that pocket, the flame survives. Every shelter belt threw a long pocket of calm across the fields behind it, and the trees did more than block wind. In winter, they caught the blowing snow and held it on the fields instead of letting it scour away. And that trapped snow melted into the soil in spring like a slow, free irrigation. They shaded the ground and cut the brutal evaporation that had been baking the last of the moisture out of the dirt. Between 1935 and 1942, workers, many of them pulled from the relief programs that put the unemployed back on the payroll, planted around 220 million trees across the plains, more than 18,000 miles of windbreaks, stitched across the landscape in long, dark lines. Meanwhile, Bennett got his agency. The law that passed after his dust-darkened hearing created the Soil Conservation Service, and it sent technicians out across the country to teach contour plowing and strip cropping and stubble mulching farm by farm, county by county, organizing the farmers themselves into local conservation districts that still exist today. And slowly, the same machine that had destroyed the plains began to run in reverse. The trees slowed the wind, so less soil lifted. Less soil lifting meant the organic matter could start to rebuild. Cover crops and stubble held the rain that did fall, so more moisture stayed in the ground. More moisture meant grass and crops could root again. More roots meant more soil held in place, which meant more cover, which meant even less erosion. The death spiral had a twin, a recovery spiral, and it climbed just as relentlessly as the collapse had fallen. And then at the end of the decade, the thing Bennett had been counting on finally happened. Around 1939, the rains came back, but this time the soil was still there to receive them. That is the entire point. The conservation work did not end the drought. Nothing could end the drought. It simply kept the topsoil from running away so that when the water finally returned, the land was ready to grow again instead of being a lifeless plain of dead dirt. The numbers from the recovery are staggering. By 1938, before the rains had even returned, the conservation measures on treated land had cut the amount of soil blowing away by roughly 65%. 220 million trees in the ground, over 18,000 miles of living windbreak. A federal soil agency that grew into the modern Natural Resources Conservation Service. with conservation practices now running across hundreds of millions of acres of American farmland. Decades later, the same core idea, take the most fragile ground and put permanent cover back on it, produced the Conservation Reserve Program, which has paid farmers to return tens of millions of acres of marginal land to grass and trees, well over 30 million acres at its peak. The plains that had emptied out began to fill back in. The farms that survived learned to work with the wind and the soil instead of against them. And the proof that it had actually worked came the hard way with a second test. In the 1950s, another severe drought struck the southern plains, just as long and just as dry as the one in the 1930s. By every measure, the dust should have risen again. It did not, or at least nowhere near as badly, because the Shelterbelts were standing and the soil was covered and the roots were back in the ground holding everything down. Same sky, same lack of rain, a different outcome, and the only thing that had changed was that the LID was back on the system. That contrast is the whole lesson written in dirt. But the story carries a warning in its tail, because a lid that was put on can always be lifted off again. In the decades since, as farms got bigger and machines got wider, and center pivot irrigation pulled water up from deep underground, many of those old shelter belts were bulldozed out, ripped up because a row of trees is an inconvenience to a giant modern planter. And in dry years, on cleared ground, the dust has crept back in places, a quiet reminder that the physics never went away. The plains did not stop being dry and windy. They were simply being held. The Dust Bowl was never really a story about the weather. The rain that failed in 1931 had failed 100 times before, across 10,000 years, and the grassland had shrugged it off every time. What made the 1930s different was one human decision, repeated across millions of acres, to remove the single thing that held the whole system together, and then to act surprised when the system came apart. The disaster was man-made, every grain of it, and so was the cure. But the cure was not clever, and it was not expensive, and it did not ask anyone to invent something new. It only asked people to understand that you cannot fight the sky, but you can hold the ground. Cover the soil, slow the wind, put the roots back. Gravity and biology and a couple 100 million trees did the rest. Because sometimes the most advanced technology in the world is a blade of grass with a long enough root. Sometimes it is a single row of trees standing between the wind and a field, and sometimes saving an entire region is just a matter of putting the lid back on something we never should have pried open in the first place. If a place clawing its way back from the dead is the kind of story you want more of, subscribe, because there are plenty more of them coming.